going to be looking this morning in 1 Samuel chapter 17. That should be in your notes. It's also on the YouVersion app. If you click More and Events, you'll see all the notes listed on the inside of that. But first, I want to tell you a little story. The soldiers trained hard, high up in the mountains where they were concealed from the enemy. They were training and waiting. See, they had received the order from the Pope during the Crusades to go out and to kill all of the infidels. So that's what they did. And of course, there were many crusades that came and went, but there was no expiration date on this order. So these knights, who at one point became separated from the rest of their company as they were traveling from France through the mountains, they stopped at this place in the mountains. This place they only intended to be at for a little while. And they formed a community. They raise their families. And they wait and wait for the day that will come again where they will receive word that the war is back on. And their services will once again be needed. Now, it wasn't easy to get messages up this treacherous mountain. But one day, they received word. There's a war. We need your help once again. So these brave knights, they began shining up their armor. They get their shields ready. They start sharpening their swords. They head out to the battlefield. They go into the city, to the governor's steps. They say, we hear there's a war. We're ready to jump in and help. The governor looks at them a little bit confused. He considers the men in their shining armor, their lances held high, their swords and their shields. And he says, well, the war started about a year ago, but better late than never. So they say, well, we'll make it up to you. We just received word. We came as fast as we could. We will make it up to you on the battlefield. And so the men go out. The enemy is not expecting these knights in shining armor. They look at them with curiosity as they see them with the lances held high, the sword, the shields, the shining armor, which seem out of place and time to the enemy in the trenches of World War I. Now, lest you think that these knights, these Kevser knights, were quickly eliminated by the modern machine guns and mortar fire. No, their allies actually gave them rifles to shoot while they were out there and trained them on them. And these Kevser knights brandished their rifles and still went out to the battlefield in full suits of armor, which should have been curious to the enemy. This is armor that they've had hanging in their homes for nearly 800 years, waiting from generation to generation. This hangs up in the living room. And one day you receive word to go to battle. And they bring it down, knock the dust off of the rust, and they wear these suits of armor again out into the battlefield. And they were actually, these Kevser knights were known for their bravery in battle. They were ferocious. They fought alongside the allies, and they might have looked a little strange wearing this ancient armor. But it wasn't the first or last time that people tried that out on the battlefield. The moral of that story being, don't underestimate the underdog. They just might surprise you. You know, this reminds me of another story, of another group of mountains, when warriors came down from this different set of mountains in ancient Palestine. This mountain range was along the eastern side of Palestine. It's still there to this day. And some of the most important cities were in that mountain range. Cities like Bethlehem, Hebron, and Jerusalem. And there the people of God resided in modern, a little bit safety, would probably be the best word. They resided in the best safety they could possibly get because, as you can see here and you can see in your notes, it's a little bit safer up in the mountains. But sometimes they did get attacked. You had people who lived on the coast who could go up these valleys. There was a system of valleys. You could travel up through the valleys. You could trace them all the way up to the top of the mountains to attack the people of God. So if you were going to attack Israel, this is how you would do it. And one day, that's exactly what happens. the Philistines, one of the most ferocious enemies of God's people, started advancing. And they rest, as you can see here, along the southern border. They get up in the mountains on the southern range of mountains. Saul's people, they camp out on the northern range of mountains. And so there they are, at a stalemate, because if you are on a mountain and your enemy is on a mountain and there's a valley in between, the only way that you can attack your enemy is to come down the mountain, go through the valley, and then go up the other mountain, which of course is not really an option. You'd be vulnerable. You'd be exposed. So the Philistines come up with a way to break the deadlock. They're going to break this stalemate. They send down their mightiest warrior, and he's a giant. He's over 9 feet tall. In our scripture passage today, we read that his armor weighs more than some of the Israelite soldiers would probably weigh. He's brandishing the sword and the spear and the javelin. He's got all of this modern armor on him. And the understanding, when the Philistines send down to the valley, their mightiest warrior is that Israel, too, will send down their mightiest warrior. This was actually a common practice of warfare in that time called single combat. And the idea was, we'll send our best warrior, you send your best warrior, and they'll duke it out. Whoever wins this confrontation, that side wins. We don't have to have the bloodshed of both armies all defeated. Whoever wins the single combat, they have won for their side, and the other side surrenders. They give up. That is the deal. So, Goliath, the giant, he steps out of the ranks of the Philistine army, and he taunts Israel. He makes fun of them, and he makes fun of their God. This goes on for more than 30 days. The Israelite camp, all of the soldiers, as the song said, shaking in their armor. No one has the strength to stand. No one feels equipped enough. Everybody feels they are not equipped enough to go out against this giant. Now, my question to you this morning is, do you ever feel like that? Do you ever feel like there's a giant in your path? You're ill-equipped to face him. You feel like someone should do something, but it can't be me. I can't conquer that giant. Do you feel like the giant is taunting you, teasing you, watching you squirm and daring you to move? But you say, no, if my giant is on the other side, I'm going to stand right here because there's no way that I can face him. If he's standing in my path, there's no getting around him. I'll never advance in my life and meet my life goals because that giant is there menacing and holding me back. If I went down to attack him, I'd have to go down into the valley and I'd be vulnerable and exposed, and that just doesn't seem like a good option. So if you ever felt any of those things, you get a sense of the fear and trepidation that the Israelite soldiers feel as they encounter this giant. Meanwhile, there's this young shepherd boy named David. He's the youngest son of his family. The youngest son. And his tribe is the least of among all the tribes. So David would be the runt of the litter, of the people who are the runt of the litter. He's the lowest of the low on the chain. And his 3 older brothers are in the army. Meanwhile, David's job is to stay home. They're out in the army. He's staying home. He's taking care of the sheep. He is the shepherd. And occasionally his father will load him up with supplies and send him to send supplies to his brothers. So his father, Jesse, loads him up with supplies and tells him, hey, take these supplies to your brother. Give them a little bit of encouragement. Bring back a report. And hey, while you're there, tell them when they conquer the Philistines and they loot the place, to bring back a good souvenir for the family. So David, this little shepherd boy, he's loaded down with supplies from his father. And he puts the sheep in the care of another shepherd. He goes out to the front lines. And as we see him approach the front lines, the Israelite soldiers are shouting their war cry. Well, that tells us something, because what did the Philistines want to do? They want single combat. We want one-on-one. What are the Israelites doing? They're rallying themselves for battle. So the Israelites have looked out at this giant and said, oh, none of us are going to attack this giant. We're just going to go to war. And I've picked out my guy I'm going to fight. He's way over here. and the giant's here. I'm going to go way to the left of the giant, or maybe I'm going to go way to the right of the giant, but I'm certainly not going to go after him. He's somebody else's problem. And so the Israelite army is trying to gear themselves up. They're shouting their war cry. They're trying to gather up their courage. But what does Goliath do? Goliath steps out of the Philistine army, and he taunts them. He teases them, kind of jumps at them a little bit. Every time he jumps at them, they shrink back. They jump backwards. So it's the worst pep rally in history. The Israelite soldiers, what do we want? Victory. When do we want it? Oh, here he comes. Here he comes. Oh, gosh. Is he gone yet? Is he gone? Did you see that guy? He was so tough. I bet he eats apples with a knife and he's not even afraid of cutting his tongue. Oh, I can't go up against him. Maybe you can go against him. Maybe we send Larry. He's our tallest guy. Maybe we send Ben. He's good with the sword. Oh, no, but it can't be me. Certainly not me. So this keeps happening. The Israelite soldiers keep on rallying up their courage. And as soon as they rally up their courage, Goliath kind of jumps at them. They shrink back. David comes to the front lines. He sees what's going on. He starts asking about it. He says, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine? The soldiers tell him, well, the king has offered his daughter's hand in marriage, and your family won't have to pay taxes. David starts to think about that. He says, I have to file my taxes and I get a woman. This is a pretty good deal. So he starts talking to the other soldiers, verifying these claims. This is true. And his brother, his oldest brother, is there, Eliab. Eliab catches wind of the conversation. And you can see a little bit of sibling rivalry, or maybe not rivalry, is maybe not the right word. Sibling agitation. You can see how he's agitated with his sibling. We see that in 1 Samuel 17, starting with verse 28. When Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle. And I love David's response, typical sibling response. Now what have I done? Said David, can't I even speak? He then turned away to somebody else and brought up the same matter, and the men answered him as before. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. Now, if you are a sibling, or if you have raised siblings, you can just hear the arguing, can't you? Can't you just see the faces of these two brothers as they're arguing? The oldest brother, aggravated by his younger sibling. You're being responsible. Get out of here. This is none of your business. You're just sticking your nose in this business. You just came down here to watch the fight, get a good show. You're making this all about you. And then David's response, excuse me, but I can talk to whoever I want to, and you're sticking your nose in my business. And David turns around and continues to talk to the soldiers about taking down this mighty Philistine giant. So word gets to Saul. The soldiers pass word to them and they say, hey, there's this guy in the camp. We're all scared of Goliath, but there's this guy in the camp. He's talking about he thinks he can take him. Saul gets a little excited. Says, hell, bring him on, bring him on. Everybody else has been shaking in their armor. Let's bring on this guy who can take down the mighty giant. So they bring in David. Saul is all excited, and then he gets here. Well, did you come to send word that the mighty warrior is on his way? No, that's him. That's him. Saul was just disappointed. And here, little scrappy David says, look me at him, I'll tear him up. Just point me in the right direction. And Saul was just there. Oh, gosh. No, just no. You're a little boy. You can't take on this giant. He is well equipped for this. You're not equipped for this. He's been training since his youth for this battle. He is a battle-hardened veteran, and you're just a shepherd boy. No, you can't do this. You don't have the equipment to do this. And David respectfully disagrees. He says, oh, but I do. You see, I used to keep my father's sheep. And every once in a while, a bear or a lion would go and it would get one of the sheep and take it off. And I'd chase it down. Now that tells us right there that David's got strong legs, doesn't he? If he could chase down a lion. And he says, I would come up upon the lion or the bear, I'd grab it by the hair, and I would strike it and kill it. David's pretty strong. He's killing huge beasts with his bare hands, it sounds like. So he says he has been equipped for this. But more than any of that, he says, I've got God on my side. I've got God on my side. That's my true weapon. And the Philistine, while I was out slaying the beast, the bear, the lion, he'll be just like another beast. He'll be just like any of those other animals, those filthy animals that I slaughtered. He'll be just like them. So Saul kind of shrugs his shoulders, says, well, nobody else has signed up. Go and God be with you. You're going to need him if you're going to go up against this mighty giant. So Saul puts on David his own tunic, his own coat of armor, a bronze helmet, and a sword. The kinds of tools that you would equip a normal soldier with. Not the kind of things that David had been equipped with in his life. And he tries on this armor, he tries walking around in it, he says, I can hardly walk. I can't wear this. I'm not used to it. So he takes that off, and he chooses instead to wear his own clothes. And he goes down to the creek bed. You can actually see it in your picture in your notes. He goes down to the creek bed, and there he chooses 5 smooth stones, puts those in his pouch. He grabs his shepherd's staff and he starts heading towards Goliath. He starts heading down the mountain into the valley towards this giant. Now the giant, named Goliath, he sees this young man coming down into the valley, and the scripture says that David is handsome and glowing with youth. Now what do we think about when we think about Goliath? He's probably got some battle scars. He probably looks rough and rugged, and he's been out, leathery skin, scars all over him, nasty. And here comes the pretty boy. Take him down. He's a little insulted. And the pretty boy doesn't have any suit of armor or a sword or a shield or anything like that. He's just carrying a shepherd's staff. And frankly, Goliath sounds a little bit insulted. He says, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And he starts leveling insults at David. He starts swearing by his gods how he, in gruesome detail, is going to feed David's corpse, his bloody corpse, to the animals in the wilderness. Now, most people, they would turn tail and run. That's what they did. We look at what the Israelites' response was to Goliath when they were at a distance. They turn around and they run, but not David. David says, no, I'm equipped for this. I've been trained by God for this moment. David is actually better equipped than anybody else on the battlefield that day. You see, in ancient times, there were 3 different types of troops. You had your infantry, the foot soldiers. They would wear those huge coats of armor. They would have the sword, the shield, the javelin, all of this kind of weaponry. Then you had the cavalry. These were the soldiers that were on horseback. And lastly, but not least, you had the artillery. Now, artillery consisted of a couple different things. There were people with bows and arrows, but more prominently and more important for our story, there were the slingers. These were people armed with slingshots. No, this wasn't the slingshot that you might have played with as a kid, that Y-shaped handle with a rubber band. No, this was a different kind of slingshot, a long rope with a leather pouch, and you would sling it about. And then when you released it, you released that stone at a high velocity. We see that slingers were actually a super important part of the artillery back in biblical wars. We see examples, and I put these in your notes, in Judges 2016, how a slinger, properly trained, could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. We see in 2 Kings how one of the towns was finished off by the slingers. We see in 1 Chronicles 12 how there were some slingers who were good with a sling with their right hand or their left hand. They were good at firing those off from both hands. And we see countless other examples. You see, Goliath in the story, he's heavy infantry, as evidenced by the description of his armor. And David, in this moment, he's artillery. Now, everyone expected Goliath to go up in single combat with someone else from the infantry. That's what Goliath expected when he headed down into the valley. And that's what Saul expected, because remember, he starts to try to give David a sword and a shield. You're going against the giant? Well, you must need these weapons of infantry, a sword and shield. That's certainly what everybody expected. What a surprise to Goliath to show up with a knife to a gunfight. You see, when David picked up these 5 stones, These were not your ordinary stones. No, they were barium sulfate. Now, barium sulfate is twice the density of a normal rock, so these were heavier. Also, when David slung that sling around, he's making 6 or 7 revolutions per second. So when he releases it, it's going to have more velocity, it's going to have more stopping power than the fastest baseball thrown by the best pitcher. And if we want to do a ballistics report on this, the stopping power of that stone is roughly equivalent of a couple hundred yards to a 45 millimeter handgun. So, yet again, what a surprise to show up with a knife to a gunfight. Now, I wonder if God prepared David with the lion and with the bear. God used those to prepare David for this giant. Then what might it be in your own life? What is the beast in your own life, that obstacle that you have to slay? That perhaps God is preparing you for a giant to come. A giant is in your path. A giant, an obstacle, a task that you have been uniquely trained and equipped to tackle. Everyone else might say, I can't tackle this giant. I can't take him down. And that's because it's your giant. Maybe this is your giant, your task for you to conquer. It's not on somebody else. This giant is in your path, and it's your job to take it down. God has equipped you. God has prepared you for this moment. And just like he has protected you from the lion, and he spared you from the bear, he will protect you from this giant, and the next giant, and the next giant. You see, this story isn't ultimately about the small shepherd boy. It's not about his superior weapon on the battlefield or even his ability to use it. No, this story is about David's ultimate weapon, his real weapon, which is God. And see, David recognizes that. Before this ever gets started, we see what he says in verse 45. David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." So David makes it clear from the outset that the weapons Goliath comes at him with, they don't matter. Because David's weapon is God. Goliath says, "I'm going to feed your rotting flesh to the animals out in the wilderness." And David says, "Oh no, it's the other way around. God is going to bring the victory to our side and for his glory. And the whole world will see it and know that there is a God in Israel." Now, even though we do see David strike down Goliath, and he takes Goliath's sword and he chops off his head, even though we see that, before all of this starts, David says beforehand, it's not by the sword or the spear that God will bring the victory. Now, David's not being clever here. He's not saying, God's not going to win this by a sword or a spear. It's a slingshot. He's not being clever here. You see, God isn't going to save by the slingshot either. Because remember, the deal was, whoever won in single combat, that side won. And the enemy had to surrender. Well, what happens after David slays the giant in single combat with his slingshot? The Philistines don't surrender. They turn tail and run. You can actually see on your picture in your notes of the road that they took to run away. So now Israel still has to fight the Philistines, who are now in retreat. They have to go after them now. And Scripture says that the roadway that the Philistines used to escape is littered with the body of the Philistines, because God delivers them into the hands of Israel. See, slaying the giant wasn't how God won the battle. David didn't kill all of those soldiers, all those Philistines, with a slingshot. God won the victory. Goliath was just the example that God used, where he conquered their mightiest warrior before he destroyed all of their other warriors. God was making a point. Now, can you point to times in your own life where God has helped you to conquer a giant and use it as an example of his power, and other people have seen it? Can you think of times in your own life where you were able to slay the giant? It was with God's help, and it was so clearly from God's help that people said there is a God in this person's heart, and he is seriously doing something. This God must mean business. Now, this isn't the last giant that David faced in his life. You know? There were the other giants. David gets a reputation that is better than Saul's reputation. Saul gets jealous of him, decides to chase him down, try to kill him. When David eventually becomes the king, one of his own sons from his own kingdom tries to wrestle free control of the kingdom and take it by force. And just like God delivered David from the bear and the lion and the giant, God delivered David from another giant and another giant and another giant. And he'll do the same for you. We see David writing in the Psalms. One of my favorite Psalms, Psalm 22, how he writes about beasts circling around him, seeking to devour him. They're at his feet. This is the same psalm that Jesus quotes when he's on the cross, hanging up there, and men like beasts are circling about his feet, seeking to destroy him. Where Jesus is on the cross and he wins the ultimate victory. He slays the ultimate giant, sin, our separation away from him, so that we can be reconciled to God through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross. So this morning, if you feel ill-equipped, feel like you've never encountered anything like this giant in your life, you say, I'm ill-equipped to do this, I can't conquer this giant. Remember that you've got a hidden weapon that the devil doesn't have. You've got God. You might think that evil has come with all of its armor and its swords and everything to come against you. You say, how can I come against some huge giant in my life like this? But with God on your side, we are more than conquerors. Evil is not better equipped. Evil is the one that is ill-equipped. Satan's forces are the ones that have showed up with a knife to a God fight. So this morning, I'd love to pray with you about the giants in your own life. Perhaps you'd like to receive God into your life for the first time. You'd like to put your trust in him. He can slay your giants, so that all might know that there is a God in your heart, that he might receive the glory. With God, we are more than conquerors, and we can conquer with even the smallest rock. So I invite you this morning, if maybe you just need a little reminder this week, as you've got a giant in your own life, and you maybe just need a little reminder, you take one of these rocks. You can come forward as we sing this last song and take one of these little rocks. Maybe you can put it on your desk at work. Maybe you can put it on your dresser at home. Just do me a favor. Don't actually slay your giant with this. It's just a metaphor, so I appreciate that. But maybe just as a reminder, if you want to come forward as we sing this last song, I'd love to pray with you. You might want to kneel at the altar. You might want to take one of these little rocks with you just as a little reminder that even something so small as this, God can use it to slay the giants in your own life. And perhaps you'd love to join the church. We would love to have you. We would love to make you part of this family of faith officially, so that we all together, as the people of God, walk hand in hand, claiming the victory in Christ, standing in opposition to the giants in our own lives and in other people's lives. We come together against injustice for Jesus' name. Won't you please come forward as we sing this final song?